Joe Biden is the 46th and current president, allegedly, having assumed office on January 20th, 2021. Grover Cleveland, whose supporters praised him for his moral rectitude, was accused of fathering a child out of wedlock and abandoning the mother. Republican-leaning newspapers ran a mocking cartoon of a young boy crying.
The jingle became, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" The Democrats turned it back around, gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha.
Rutherford B. Hayes beat Samuel J. Tilden in 1876. He won this election by literally one electoral vote. After midnight, Bush's victory seemed so assured that Gore actually called Bush to congratulate him on winning. But just 45 minutes later, as Gore prepared to give his concession speech, aides told him that Bush's lead in Florida was shrinking fast. Gore called Bush back a second time and said, I want that back. The individual with the votes of a majority of electors became president and the runner-up became vice president. Imagine if Joe Biden had won in 2020 and Donald Trump was his vice president. Jerry, I seem to recall you had a pretty good Nixon impersonation.
I am not a crook.
Welcome to a historic episode of Tennis Podcast here on a historic day in America and the world. This episode is releasing on November 5th, 2024, which is what day, Jerry? What day is that?
That is Election Day.
That is Election Tuesday. By the time many of you, maybe most of you, listen to this episode, you will already know who the next president of the United States is. Well, unless there's months of litigation, but hopefully not.
It's not like that hasn't been a thing.
Oh, Jerry, you don't even know what we're going to talk about today. For me and my guest, however, we are recording this a little before the election. So even though this is releasing on Election Day, me and Jerry don't know who is going to be president as of the time of recording this. But if he were to ever run for president, I'd vote for him, and that's Jerry Landry. Jerry, thank you for joining me today.
Nick, thanks so much for having me on again.
Always a pleasure. Love having you here. Jerry is the host of the podcast called Presidencies of the United States. It's one of the best history podcasts out there, and there's no one that I know personally that I would turn to before you for presidential history and analysis. So I'm really excited to have you here today on this presidential themed episode.
Glad to offer what 2 cents I can.
I think you have a few more than 2 cents, but we will see. Before we get going, I want to remind the listeners that if you recognize Jerry's voice, it's because he's been here before. We talked about the top 10 wealthiest presidents, the biggest presidential scandals, and most recently, the founding fathers of America. But today, in honor of Election Day, we're going to do a very timely list. And Jerry, you're going to be guessing the top 10 closest presidential elections in American history. Which elections were won by the slimmest of margins in history? How do you think you'll do?
I can already think of a few off the top of my head. So
A few of these you've covered on your show too. And I want to say right up top, in case you're wondering and listening to me now, a few things. Number one, you're probably sick of hearing about the 2024 election between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So we're not going to talk about it today. Okay. We're going to stick with historical elections only. And I will try my best to not bring it to today's election. The second thing I want to say is if you're not into history or American history, everything we're going to cover today is super relevant to even today's times because there's not much in American history that we haven't seen in some shape or form in the past. What's the saying? The best way to learn from history is not to repeat it. How's that saying go? What am I trying to say? Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. That's the one, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, all that said, Jerry, how many times have you committed election fraud?
You got to have a hobby, right?
Oh, your hobby is election fraud. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, why not? What is it? I know you've talked about this before, but it's been a while. We have new listeners too. Can you just tell the listeners kind of the elevator pitch on what is it about American presidential history that fascinates you so much and inspired you to, make it one of your biggest hobbies and the podcast you have, all that stuff?
Absolutely. Presidential history in America has always fascinated me. As long as I can remember, I've been studying our political history as a nation, and there is so much to it. And even beyond just the people who have served as chief executive, there are so many people who have contributed for better or worse to the success or failure of each of the presidencies. And so that is my purpose in the Presidencies of the United States podcast, is exploring some of these stories that folks don't know and don't understand. And as we learn in my podcast, there is so much in history that is relevant to the modern era. There are things
today. Yeah.
Yes. There are so many
And
things
that's what stood out to me. Sorry, I don't mean to talk over you, Jerry, but I was going to say that in doing research for this episode, like, because we're going to talk about the top 10, and pretty much every one of the top 10, I was like, oh, this is familiar. I've seen this happen recently. Or, oh, I thought this was a new phenomenon, but no, this was happening way back in the early 1800s, that sort of thing. So it's just interesting how, as far as civilization and government has evolved in the last 200 or 300 years, it's still really at the core. It's like you see the same few things happen all the time. So it's interesting.
And for me, even though you can look at it one way and say, how have we not learned how to do things better? There's also a sense of we've survived this stuff before. And I think that we can find our way through again and hopefully find a way to do things better and grow as people, as a society and culture. We do what we can.
I am so ready to get this all behind us, no matter what happens. And I do lean one way, I'm sure the listeners could guess, but no matter what happens, I'm ready to move on. But to Jerry's point, there's so much we can learn from history. And now I'm going to give a brief history lesson. I ask everyone to bear with me as I edutain you on the presidential election process. How does it work? Here's how it works. In a United States presidential election, the popular vote is the total number or percentage of votes cast for a candidate by voters in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. So that is when you go to the ballot box and you cast your vote, all those are counted up. That's the popular vote. The candidate who gains the most votes is said to have won the popular vote. But you can win the election without winning the popular vote, which I personally think is bullshit. I want your take on that soon, Jerry. But the way it works currently is the presidential elections are indirect elections. The votes cast on election day are not cast directly for a candidate, but for members of the Electoral College. The Electoral College's electors then formally elect the president and vice president. That comes out to 538 electors as of 2020. As of 2024, California holds the most electoral votes with 54, followed by Texas with 40, and the lowest are all tied at 3 each, which is Washington, D.C., Wyoming, Alaska, Delaware, the Dakotas, and Vermont. Basically, the way it works is the larger your population, the more electoral votes your state. So proponents of the Electoral College argue that it requires presidential candidates to have broad appeal across the country to win, while critics argue that it is not representative of the popular will of the nation. Critics also object to the inequity that, due to the distribution of electors, individual citizens in states with smaller populations can sometimes have more voting power than those in larger states. Let me pause there. Jerry, give me your hot takes on the Electoral College.
And that's the thing about the Electoral College, this argument that it somehow makes candidates focus on smaller states. It doesn't. We see it every election cycle. Where are the candidates going? They are primarily going to the swing states. They're going to the states that they're going to get the most electoral votes.
Pennsylvania, Ohio,
Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina. It doesn't play out like it's supposed to, and it creates a barrier between the people and the actual candidates. It sets up the system. And back in the day, you hear the arguments from the Constitutional Convention that people didn't understand politics because media and communication wasn't what it is now. It was, how can somebody know the candidates and the issues if they're far removed from the nation's capital? But where we're at nowadays, we know we have access to communication, we have access to knowledge and to information in a way that we never have before. So why do we need this antiquated system that's supposed to protect us, quote unquote?
Right. Its original design and intent seems like we've far outgrown it.
Yeah.
We've had recent elections. The most recently in 2016, when the candidate that lost the popular vote, that means they got fewer votes from the people than the other person. That person won the presidency. And I don't think that's right. And I know there's pros and cons to the Electoral College. I would say, and I think you would say based on your answer, that the cons outweigh the pros. And I would be in favor of a fully, put the power in the people's hands. Who the people vote for is who should be president. Plain and simple, in my opinion. Yeah.
Because it's basically playing out exactly like that. But you also have weird circumstances where, because of where the votes are being cast, the person that the people choose is not necessarily the person that becomes president. And there are a number of instances of that in presidential history.
Disenfranchises people from voting sometimes because the example I gave earlier, Oklahoma. I know that Oklahoma is going to vote red every election for the foreseeable future. I'm going to vote, but I see and I hear from people that would vote that say there's no point in voting here in Oklahoma because it's going to be red no matter what I vote, even if I support red votes, which is I realize we do have listeners that aren't in America. Red means Republican. Red is the right side of the spectrum, which is Republican. Left is the blue or Democratic side of the spectrum. And for a lot of states like Oklahoma and many others, history shows they're going to vote one way. And so it can make individual people less likely to go vote, which I think in a way defeats the whole purpose. So
yeah, unless you have instances like Nebraska and Maine where they have electoral votes that are basically by congressional district. And so you can have an instance where you have a blue part of the state that they'll at least get one electoral vote from there.
Yes.
But most states in the U.S., it is winner take all. It's basically it's all or nothing.
Well, we're going to talk a lot about it today, but I want to give a quick summary that 45 people, as of the date we're recording this, have served 46 presidencies spanning 58 four-year terms. Joe Biden is the 46th and current president, allegedly, having assumed office on January 20th, 2021. 9 vice presidents have become president by virtue of a president's intra-term death or resignation. So think about JFK, Abe Lincoln. The first president was elected in 1789, and that was a listener of the show, George Washington. So let's get to the actual list. Today's list is the top 10 closest presidential election races in American history. It is ranked by the margin of victory in the Electoral College. So I will read stats for the popular vote, but the popular vote actually plays no part in today's ranking. The smaller the margin of victory, based on electoral votes, the higher on the list the election is. And I'll note that the Electoral College operated differently in early elections, but those have been adjusted using a normalized margin of victory formula. That list comes from actual presidential election data with supporting data from History.com, Britannica, the U.S. Election Atlas, and Wikipedia. Before we get to the closest elections, do you have one off the top of your head of like an election that was a complete blowout?
I can tell you that the election of 1936 is not on this list. And
that's FDR, right?
That was FDR and Alf Landon. And I can't remember how the order went, but basically there was a saying that so goes Maine, also goes Vermont, because those were the only 2 states that Alf Landon won in the entire 48 states at that point.
Can you imagine that today? Modern elections are so evenly contested, pretty much every election in my lifetime. But back in 1936, and there's a few others like that too, but one candidate just dominates the map. And FDR, the last president to serve more than 2 terms, and is now not possible to serve more than 2 terms. So historic in a lot of ways. Yeah. And I want to give one last bit of context here for listeners that I know most listeners listening probably don't live and breathe presidential history like you do, Jerry. So in the 2020 election, the winner was Joe Biden, allegedly again. He won a margin of victory in the Electoral College. He won 57% of the electoral votes compared to Donald Trump's 43%. And he won the margin victory in the popular vote. He won by 4% there. And I also have the voter turnout. 67% of people eligible to vote in this country turned out to vote, which was the highest percentage since the 1900 election. So in over 100 years, had the highest voter turnout in the 2020 election. Interesting, right? But even that, only 67% of people that could vote did vote.
1840 was the highest to date voter turnout. I believe it was over 80% of registered voters, which of course at that point was white males. But the fact that we had, over 80% voter turnout, it's something that we don't see that often.
I see here 1876, 83% highest turnout percentage. But, back in those early days, like especially the early 1800s, it amazes me that there was any sort of organized system of voting, right? Because those were all handwritten, hand counted, just seems like so much room for error and corruption. But they figured it out.
Yes.
All right. Give me a guess, Jerry. closest elections in history. Maybe you know already, and this is just going to be a cakewalk for you.
I've got a few in mind that I know are on the list, but let's start with the election of 1888.
1888. Who is in that election?
So that is Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland.
I have a Grover Cleveland election on this list, but it is not that one.
So let's go with 1892.
Is that Cleveland again?
Yes.
Go the other way, other direction.
1884.
1884. See, I thought you were a history expert here, Jerry. The presidential election between Grover Cleveland and James G. Blaine of 1884. In this election, Democratic Governor Grover Cleveland of New York narrowly defeated Republican James G. Blaine of Maine. Is everyone hearing that? James G. Blaine of Maine. How much do you think his name rhyming with Maine helped or hurt him in the election? Like, is that a pro or a con in the mind of voters? Like, what an asshole! His name rhymes with the state he's from, or is it like, oh, that could make a good little jingle, Blaine from Maine? I don't know.
Well, they did kind of use that a little bit. He was called the Continental Liar from the state of Maine.
Okay. Close enough to what I was saying. Well, Grover Cleveland won 55% of the electoral votes he needed, but the margin of victory in the popular vote was less than 1%, 0.57%. So by less than a 1% margin is how much difference there was in the popular vote, which is crazy. Really high turnout here, voter turnout, registered voters, 78% of registered voters turned out for this election. Republican candidate James Blaine from Maine didn't look like he had a chance, but then came the scandal. Grover Cleveland, whose supporters praised him for his moral rectitude, was accused of fathering a child out of wedlock and abandoning the mother. Republican-leaning newspapers ran a mocking cartoon of a young boy crying. Jerry, fill us in.
And it becomes this election scandal, that he had supposedly fathered this child out of wedlock. And so the jingle became, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?"
Where's my pa? Mm-hmm.
And the Democrats turned it back around, gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha.
Which I fucking love that. I love that. You don't see that a ton in history of like turning it around on them with such delicious revenge like that, but it really worked out.
And especially, the fact that Cleveland said, once this was starting to come out, in so many instances in political history, we see folks trying to cover up scandals. And his response to it was to tell his folks, tell the truth. Just let's go ahead and say, you know what? Here's the deal.
Grover Cleveland did not deny the accusation. His campaign tried to refocus the race on political issues. His popularity did take a hit, and as a result, Blaine, who had previously stood little chance, became a real contender. And in the end, they had it basically came down to New York, and Grover Cleveland won New York by just 1,047 votes, or 0.09% of all votes cast in that state. And that razor-thin victory in New York assured Grover the 36 electoral votes that New York offered, and that allowed him to beat Blaine. This is also a significant election in U.S. history because it marked an interruption in the era where Republicans largely controlled the presidency between the Reconstruction after the Civil War and the Great Depression that began in 1929. Cleveland, who would be elected to another non-consecutive term in 1892, he became the only Democratic president between the end of the Civil War and 1912 with Woodrow Wilson, a span of almost 50 years. That's huge. And if you're wondering about Grover Cleveland, his legacy, he's praised by historians for his honesty, integrity, adherence to his morals, defying party boundaries, and effective leadership. And he's typically ranked in the middle to upper tier of U.S. presidents. Do you agree with that?
He's a figure that I don't think gets enough attention, and especially the fact that, to this point, as of our recording, he is the only person who had 2 non-consecutive terms. The fact that he ran in 3 elections, won, lost, and came back, shows that he is a political force of the time. But then also the fact that he was a president in a time that so much in politics was changing in America. It's fascinating. He's one of the figures that I I always love the opportunity to get to study Cleveland a bit more. Don't necessarily agree with him all the time, but
Yeah, sure.
I do also.
But you don't have to.
Yeah.
Right? That's the thing. Like, and I think people forget that sometimes in the modern age, including myself in this, that like, you don't have to agree with 100% of the points that a politician is saying. You have to go with the most important things. I guess I'll just leave it there. Yeah, you just have to go with what are the most important issues to you, even if you disagree with them on these other things. Where now it's so like sports team, like the Republicans is my sports team. I will only vote for them, and I will only vote against the Democrats. And I'm saying this on both sides. I'm just using Republicans as an example, but that it's just so. Do you get what I'm trying to say? Am I
Absolutely
articulating this well? Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing. The polarization. We see points in American political history where this polarization is so rampant. And unfortunately, I think we are in one of those points right now. And hopefully we'll get to another point. Hopefully we'll get to a place where, we can agree to disagree. Compromise isn't a dirty word.
It seems a long way away from now, but I hope I'm wrong.
Hi, I'm Alex Johns. And if you're anything like me, you need more. More what? Well, more Tinnish Podcast, of course. We all know Tinnish Podcast has well over 250 episodes, but there is actually way more than that. There are about 70 extra episodes of Tinnish Podcast available right now that can only be heard as a Tinnish Pod Plus member. These extra episodes cover everything from the top 10 highest grossing movies starring a cat, to the top 10 ways your house can kill you, to the top 10 most adorable Pokemon. There's also episodes that step away from list guessing completely, like when Nick and I covered the history of human sewage and sanitation, or when Nick and Brandon reacted to trending Urban Dictionary definitions. You can unlock instant access to all these bonus episodes, with more added every month, right now by joining Tinnish Pod Plus. It's easy. If you're listening to me on Apple Podcasts, just tap the Try Free button at the top of our page on Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on any other podcasting app, then go to tinnishpod.com/plus. Signing up takes 10 seconds, and you can listen to these bonus episodes right on the very app you're already listening on. By the way, Tinnish Pod Plus membership includes other perks too. All episodes are ad-free, you get episodes early before anyone else, and you can even get Dr. Buster's exclusive podcast, The Book Buster. Go to tinnishpod.com/plus to learn more and sign up for a free 7-day trial. That's tinnishpod.com/PLUS.
Okay, so that's Grover Cleveland and James Blaine from Maine. That is number 7 on the list, the 7th closest election in U.S. presidential history. So what else do you got?
1844.
I see 1848.
So you mentioned 1848, which is also an interesting election.
So 1848 is number 10 on the list. This is in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. General Zachary Taylor of the Whig Party defeated Senator Lewis Cass of the Democratic Party. Now, Zachary Taylor won 56% of the electoral votes and 47% of the popular vote, which is 47%. Remember, in the last one we talked about, Grover Cleveland won the popular vote by less than 1%. This is 47% of the popular vote, although the remaining 53% was split between a runner-up and a third party, which was Martin Van Buren, who I think had already been president by this time, yeah?
Yes, he was running on the free soil.
The population that turned out to vote, 73%. The first time election day was on a Tuesday in every state in 1848. The Whigs had the advantage of highlighting Zachary Taylor's military glories because Taylor was a general in the recent Mexican-American War. With Taylor remaining vague on the issues, the campaign was dominated by personalities and personal attacks. It's good to see nothing's changed, right? With the Democrats calling Taylor vulgar, uneducated, cruel, and greedy, and the Whigs attacking Cass for graft and dishonesty. Would you rather be graft and dishonest or vulgar and uneducated, Jerry?
Oh, gosh.
It's tough, right?
Vulgar and uneducated?
Yeah, I think so too. I think vulgar can be a good thing.
Yeah.
The division of the Democrats over slavery allowed Taylor to dominate. Remember, this is shortly before the Civil War. The division of the Democrats over slavery allowed Taylor to dominate the Northeast, but all this was didn't mean much because 16 months into his presidency, Taylor died suddenly of a stomach disease on July 9th, 1850, and his administration had accomplished very little during his time, and they made no progress on the most divisive issue in Congress and the nation at the time, which was slavery. He was succeeded by his vice president, the hugely forgettable Alec Baldwin lookalike Millard Fillmore, and historians and scholars have ranked Zachary Taylor in the bottom of U.S. presidents, owing in part to his short term of office, which was just 16 months, though he has also been described as more of a forgettable president than a failed one.
What's amazing about Taylor, so Taylor, he had this military career, but he was in no way, shape, or form involved in politics prior to getting the nomination, to the point that he hadn't really voted in any presidential elections to that point. And when he got the
Is that true? He had not voted at all in an election? Wow.
Because
that seems like disqualifying.
Well, he felt that as somebody who is a member of the military, that he shouldn't necessarily, he should be able to serve any commander in chief.
I mean, I guess.
But yeah, it was still kind of
a bad look.
It doesn't look well. But to the point that at that point, with the post office, it wasn't like nowadays where it's delivered to your house. At that point, you had to go and get it from the post office, and postage wasn't paid by the sender. It was paid by the person receiving. And so they sent, when he was nominated by the Whig Party, they sent a letter to him letting him know that he had been nominated, and they waited and waited and waited, and they never heard from him. And they finally sent somebody to let him know. And he was like, "Oh, you sent something in the mail? Oh, well, I haven't gone to the mail in a while. I'm not paying postage."
Isn't that wild? Like, think about that. Like today, like you're nominated for president. Like, of course, you know right away. Of course, you're made aware of it immediately. You're very involved in the process. Back then, for some of these guys, like, that's hilarious that he just hadn't checked his mail.
Yeah. Wow. And it speaks to the problem of Taylor, is that he was completely unaware of Washington politics, and he rubbed people the wrong way. He didn't know who the people you needed to talk to were, and so he wasn't really able to get anything done. And it speaks to, we have this idea of the outsider coming in and cleaning up the swamp or whatever you call it.
Yeah.
Taylor couldn't do that. He was a complete outsider. He couldn't get people behind him. And Fillmore didn't do much better.
No. Two things. Millard Fillmore, he really does look like Alec Baldwin. I mean,
yes.
A lot. I'll put a link in the show notes if the listeners want to see a photo of him. Zachary Taylor also looks like, the portrait I'm seeing of him looks like, oh, fuck, I got to be president. I was just doing this as a favor. Because to me, it seems like the Whig Party nominated him because they knew he'd be popular given the war recently. And not that they necessarily thought he was like, a good, candidate.
No, they thought they could control him, and they didn't know old Rough and Ready.
Yeah, this portrait, again, it looks like no one told him the war's over. But the war with stomach disease had just begun. Okay, so that is number 10. I can't remember the last time I heard someone talk about Zachary Taylor. He just seems like a complete footnote in history. But we have some big hitters on this list that are not as forgettable. You want to name one?
Okay, let's go with a big one. The election of 1960.
That has to be JFK and Nixon?
Yes.
No, but they were close. I was just outside the top 10. I do have a Nixon election in here.
1968.
God, you're good, Jerry. Number 9, Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, and George Wallace. There was actually 3 viable contenders, I think, in this election. This was in 1968. The Republican nominee, who was the former Vice President Richard Nixon, defeated the Democratic nominee and incumbent Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and the American Independent Party nominee, the former Alabama Governor George Wallace. Nixon won 56% of the electoral votes, but he won the popular vote by less than 1%. This election had a 63% voter turnout. The election was tumultuous and chaotic. It was marked by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in early April of that year, and the subsequent 54 days of riots across the nation. And then Robert F. Kennedy, who had been a frontrunner for the Democratic nomination, brother of recently assassinated JFK, the president. He was assassinated just a few months before the election. And there was also the widespread opposition to the Vietnam War across university campuses. So there was a lot going on. This was a very important election. The election was the first presidential election after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which began restoring voting rights to Black Americans in the South, where most had been disenfranchised since the early 20th century. Nixon's victory also commenced the Republican Party's lock on certain Western states that would vote for the Republican Party in every election until 1992, allowing them to win the presidency in 5 of the 6 presidential elections in that time period. Nixon was elected again in 1972, but resigned before that term completed due to the Watergate scandal. For more on the Watergate scandal, you can listen to me and Jerry's past episode, number 193, where we talked about the top 10 biggest presidential scandals. Jerry, I seem to recall you had a pretty good Nixon impersonation. Am I remembering that right? Was that you?
I am not a crook.
That's not bad, honestly.
We're keeping the dog.
He's very jowly, his jowls. He's just
you've got to get the jowls going.
Yeah, they got to be some shaking jowls in the yeah. But he just seems like you wouldn't want to be stuck talking to him at like a dinner party. It just seems like a
God no.
No.
If you get seated next to Nixon, switch seats. Find somebody else. Whoever you don't like in the room, just go ahead and give them that seat.
Yeah, ask if you can swap seats.
Yeah.
Over the summer, I went to the JFK Presidential Library and Museum. Have you been?
I have.
Yeah. Well, there was a room there where they were showing on old TVs and tried to make it look like you were sitting in a 1960s living room. And they were having the debate between Nixon and Kennedy playing on a loop. And I watched it. I watched the whole thing. And it was so remarkable how civil they were and gentlemanly. And Nixon has this reputation now for being kind of a monster and a crook and all that, but he was very likable in that, not as likable as JFK. But anyway, I'm just saying, like, debates used to be kind of a civil thing and wasn't like a reality show that it is now. So I just thought that was interesting.
Well, and the interesting thing about the 1960 election and the debates, they kept wanting more. The two campaigns kept trying to put more debates on because they wanted that FaceTime. They wanted folks to be able to get to know the candidates, to really be able to take advantage of this new medium of television versus, some modern campaigns were one and done.
Well, they were saying in that museum, like, JFK was really the first president to like utilize television, like, to help him win the election. Jerry, in old debates before television, was the only way to hear about him to like read a recap in the newspaper?
So it's interesting. They really didn't have debates like we think of. It was really more, they would have time on the radio. They would play speeches and things like that. But this idea of having two candidates, at least on the presidential level, and this goes back to like the early history of presidential elections, you weren't supposed to be seen as wanting the office. The office, it was supposed to be something, it was supposed to be a public trust. The public were supposed to call you to the office. But in the 20th century... Or
mail you a letter that you might see a few months later if you're Zachary Taylor.
When you finally actually pay the postage for it. Yeah. You get to the 20th century and we finally get this idea of, no, you really need to go out and campaign. You have to show why you actually want this office. And so naturally debates became a part of that. And it was kind of slow going at first. We have these debates in 1960 that, were revolutionary, but we don't see it again for a while. But now it's become something that is an expected part of the presidential campaign.
After 1960, they didn't have them again for a while?
They didn't. I think the next one was 1976, if I'm remembering correctly, between Carter and Ford, and that one didn't go so well, at least for President Ford.
This is a great segue. Let's talk about Carter and Ford. This is number 8. The Democratic nominee, former Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, narrowly defeated incumbent Republican President Gerald Ford. Carter won 55% of the electoral votes and a 2% margin of victory in the popular. The percentage of the nation that could vote, I believe this is the lowest we've said so far, 55%. Ford ascended to the presidency when Nixon, speaking of his ass, Nixon resigned in 1974 in the wake of Watergate, and so Gerald Ford took over after that. And the Watergate scandal badly damaged the Republican Party and its electoral prospects. Ford promised to continue Nixon's political agenda and govern as a moderate Republican, causing considerable backlash from the conservative wing of his party. Ford pursued a, quote, Rose Garden strategy, in which he sought to portray himself as an experienced leader focused on fulfilling his role as a chief executive. On the other hand, Jimmy Carter emphasized his status as a reformer who was untainted by Washington. As of 2020, this is the last election in which the Democratic candidate won the majority of the states in the South, including Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, I know someone from there, and Texas. As of 2020, the last time a Democratic won those states was Jimmy Carter. The last election until 2024, this one's crazy. Listen to this. This was the last election, 1976, where a Biden, a Clinton, or a Bush was not on the ticket as a president or vice president. So what is this, almost 50 years ago?
Yeah. It's been a long time.
Yeah. And we did have a Biden on the ticket this year until we didn't. Originally we did. Polls of historians and political scientists generally rank Carter as a below-average president, though scholars in the public more favorably view his post-presidency, which is the longest in U.S. history, because Carter is the longest-living president in U.S. history. There's a list we could do sometime, Jerry, the longest living. He's the first one to live to 100 years of age. What are your thoughts on Jimmy Carter?
So his presidency, and again, like with Ford and Carter, it's coming in the wake of Watergate. It was always going to be a challenge. And there was so much that was going on around the globe at that point. It was always going to be a challenge for anybody. And I think that scholars are looking back and giving them a little more credit than they had previously. And in particular, Carter, one of the biggest things to his credit is the Camp David Accord, being able to work towards peace in the Middle East. But there were so many challenges. And again, Carter was seen as this outsider. He was seen as somebody who could come in and clean up Washington. But he also suffered from some of the same issues that other outsiders have. You don't know the lay of the land. You don't know the players, and he rubbed people the wrong way. This was a time that the parties were still trying to figure things out in the wake of Watergate. And so it's not an admirable position to be in.
No. It's interesting. Like every time you look at an election, there's always I guess not always, but often there's you're just coming off of this big event, or you're just heading into this next big event that you don't know is coming yet. And then you start to realize there's always been something, and there's always something coming up next in history. You just go from one thing to the next, and there's always something. We're dealing with that right now. We just went through COVID, inflation. So one thing after the next, bro. So far, you have number 10, Zachary Taylor and Lewis Cass in 1848. Number 9, Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, and George Wallace in 1968. Number 8 is Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford in 1976. Number 7 is Grover Cleveland and James G. Blaine in 1884. Wow, the first 4 we've talked about are all in order, 10 through 7. So what's next?
Let's go with 1876.
1876, yes, sir. How high do you think that gets?
It's got to be in the top 3.
Number 2, you got it. 1876, this is the highest, percentage-wise, the highest voter turnout in American election history, presidential election. 83% of voters turned out. Rutherford B. Hayes beat Samuel J. Tilden in 1876. Hayes won 50% of the electoral votes, 50.14. He won this election by literally 1 electoral vote. However, he lost the popular vote by 3%. So, it's hard to get any closer than that. He won the electoral vote by 1 vote. Not only was it one of the closest presidential contests in American history, but it was also riddled with anti-democratic shenanigans, including voter intimidation and ballot tampering. Does this start to sound familiar, anybody? The candidates in 1876 were Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden. But more important than the candidates themselves were the issues at stake. We were just talking about issues. You go from one to the next. This one, though, had a big one. This took place after a decade after the Civil War, and so Reconstruction was a big part of the conversation. And one of the goals of Reconstruction in the South was to safeguard voting rights for Black Americans as enshrined in the 15th Amendment. But those efforts met violent resistance from groups like the Redemption Movement. So now Black adults in America are now legally allowed to vote, but they're being intimidated about it, and they're getting harassed about voting. So it's a big problem. Reconstruction was effectively dead by the 1876 election, and the suppression of the Black vote was rampant, resulting in Democratic victories across the South. Hayes and the Republicans cried foul and demanded recounts in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, but instead of fighting fair, the Republicans resorted to their own dirty tricks. This is according to the write-up on history.com. These aren't my words. The Democratic Attorney General of Florida came up with his own recount, declaring Tilden as the state's winner. Since the Constitution doesn't say what to do when electoral votes are contested, Congress had to come up with a solution. In this case, it was the bipartisan group of 14 congressmen and 1 Supreme Court justice. They were known as the Electoral Commission. Ultimately, this 15-person commission decided the 1876 election, who gave the presidency to Hayes and the Republicans by literally 1 vote. Jerry, did I get all that right?
You did. And it was up to the last minute. So at that point, we have Inauguration Day now on January 20th. At that point, it was March 4th, and I believe it was March 2nd before the commission finally finished their work and said, this is actually going through. It was definitely a tense time in our nation's history. Folks didn't know what was going to happen. It could have gone very wrong. The Civil War was still fresh. It was still in everybody's minds. It could have happened again. Tilden said, no, we're not going to do this. He went ahead and accepted it, even though what we know nowadays and being able to research and explore this election, honestly, Tilden probably did win.
As president, Rutherford B. Hayes implemented modest civil service reforms that laid the groundwork for further reform in the 1880s and 1890s. I think you were kind of getting to that. At the end of his term, Hayes kept his pledge not to run for re-election, and he retired home to Ohio, and historians generally rank him as an average to below average president. Okay, so what could be closer than that? Because that's number 2, but we'll get there. So give me another guess. You still need 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1.
Is 1948 on the list?
Not on here. There's only one more election you haven't guessed yet that is in the 1900s at all.
1916.
1916.
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson and Charles Evans Hughes. It's funny, sometimes in these elections, looking back through history, it's like you'll instantly recognize both names on the ballot. And then sometimes you're like, Charles Evans Hughes, who the fuck is that? I've never heard that name. I mean, you have because you're a student of this stuff, but like the average person, like Charles Hughes has been like lost to history, I feel like.
Oh,
but then there's some elections where like, I wonder if like Al Gore will be that way in like 100 years when people look back, like now we all know the name, but in 100 years, who knows? Anyway, incumbent Democratic President Woodrow Wilson narrowly defeated the former Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Charles Evans Hughes. He was the Republican candidate. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe this is the only time a justice has run for president.
Yes.
Or at least been in the party nomination, I should say.
Exactly.
So a difference of just 3,420 votes, 3,420 votes, or 0.34% of all votes cast in California. That's what led to the victory, because Wilson won those 3,000 votes, which gave him California. And because of the rules of the Electoral College, he got all those votes, which means he won the election. He won by 23 electoral votes in total. But the popular vote, he won 3%. And this has a very relatively low population turnout of 59%. Well, I was going to say they're all dying in the war, but I guess we're not in the war just yet. Very close, though. The campaign took place against the backdrop dominated by war, the Mexican Revolution and World War I. American voters wanted to avoid involvement in the war and preferred to continue a policy of neutrality. Same thing happened during World War II. Wilson's campaign used the popular slogans, "He kept us out of war," and "America First," to appeal to those voters who wanted to avoid a war in Europe or with Mexico. His opponent, Charles Evans Hughes, criticized Wilson for not taking the necessary preparations to face conflict. This election was 1916. Now, 1 year later in 1917, 1 month after his second term began, that's when the U.S. entered the war in April 1917. Scholars have generally ranked Woodrow Wilson in the upper tier of U.S. presidents, although he has been criticized for supporting racial segregation. His liberalism nevertheless lives on as a major factor in American foreign policy, and his vision of national self-determination resonates globally to this day. And I know, Jerry, we talked about this at some point, but Woodrow Wilson, in his second term, he suffered a stroke. So basically, his wife was the one running the presidential office at that time.
Yeah, so basically she controlled access to Wilson, and there weren't many people who got access to him. It would get to the point, folks would hand her documents and she'd be like, oh, I'll show them to the president. She'd take them in the back, come back, things would be signed or told, no, we're not doing that, whatever. But what happened back there, we don't know.
We don't really know how far gone Wilson was or was not. It's interesting. I thought about this too, because World War I, Woodrow Wilson's the president during World War I. He suffers a stroke, so he's disabled quite a bit. Fast forward to World War II, we also have a disabled president who dies, granted, the end of the war, but he dies during the war, and that's Franklin D. Roosevelt. So
yeah,
the parallels there is kind of interesting.
It was an interesting time. There was so much in the 1916 election, and it's interesting because Wilson actually went to bed thinking that he had lost. And then come to find out the next day, oh, wait, we may have won this.
With over 250 episodes of Tennis Podcast and counting, it can be tough to know where to start or which episode to pick next. The Tennis Podcast episode guide has you covered. Go to tennispod.com/episodes and you'll be able to see all of our episodes filtered by topic and by Sidekick host. For example, are you looking for lists about animals? Select the animals topic and you'll see every episode we have ever done relating to animals, such as the smartest animals, the deadliest animals, etc. There are dozens of topics to choose from, such as food, music, true crime, sports, and more. It's the quickest way to find Tennis Podcast episodes in the topics you're most interested in. Or maybe you're less picky about the list topic and the Sidekick host is more important to you. Say you are a psychopath and you actually want more Dr. Buster episodes. First of all, wow. Secondly, you can use the episode guide to quickly see all of the episodes Dr. Buster has ever been on. The same is true for all of our regulars, like Alex Johns, Brad Choma, and the rest. One last thing, when you find the episode, you can click into the episode to see links to all of the most popular podcast players like Spotify and Apple, as well as a short visual trailer for that episode and a full interactive transcript. The Tennis Podcast episode guide is truly your best bet in finding the next episode for you. Try it now at tennispod.com/episodes or just click the link in the show notes. We're completely done with the 1900s. Every single remaining election is outside of that century, so there's a hint for you.
I am wondering if the election of 2000 is on this list.
Some lists I saw in my research listed this as number 1, but the list I went with has this at number 3. George W. Bush and Al Gore in 2000. This is where Republican nominee, the governor of Texas, George W. Bush, narrowly defeated incumbent Democratic Vice President Al Gore. George Bush won, listen to this, you need 270 electoral votes to win. He won 271 to 266. That's close.
Yeah.
And on the popular vote, he lost by 0.51%. So it was close, but he did barely lose the popular vote. But he still won the election. The smallest turnout of the modern era, so I think the smallest turnout since like the early 1800s maybe, 54%. Both major party candidates focused primarily on domestic issues such as budget, tax relief, and reforms of federal social insurance programs, although foreign policy was not ignored. But due to President Bill Clinton's sex scandal with Monica Lewinsky, oh baby, and subsequent impeachment, Al Gore avoided campaigning with Clinton. Republicans denounced Clinton's indiscretions, while Gore criticized Bush's lack of experience. The race was neck and neck, and once again, Florida was the swing state. Whoever captured Florida's 25 electoral votes would win the presidency. Exit polls on election night showed Bush with a commanding lead in Florida. After midnight, Bush's victory seemed so assured that Gore actually called Bush to congratulate him on winning. But just 45 minutes later, as Gore prepared to give his concession speech, aides told him that Bush's lead in Florida was shrinking fast. And in an unprecedented move, Gore called Bush back a second time and said, I want that back. I'm not conceding. That had to be an awkward call. The legal fight went all the way to the Supreme Court after Gore, famously demanded a recount. The legal fight went all the way to the Supreme Court, which handed down 2 rulings. And 1, the Florida recount as it was being handled was unconstitutional. And 2, it was too late for Gore's team to issue further challenges. So in a 5-4 decision, the justices gave the victory to Bush. And at last count in Florida, Bush won by a margin of 500 votes, or 0.009% of the total votes cast in Florida. That's how close it was. And although Bush's presidency has generally been rated as below average by scholars, public opinion of him has improved since he left the office. So, I said a lot there, Jerry. Tell me about the 2000 election.
So I definitely remember this one because it was the first presidential election that I voted in.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. It was a big one, although at the time and leading into it, it was, and I still remember the SNL skits and Gore's lockbox.
Yeah.
It was seen as being so much of a dry election, and you see that in the voter turnout. The fact that it was so low, but then because it was so low, just a few votes made
all the difference. Yeah. It's funny. It's like more childish and mudslinging and like dramatic the campaigns are leading up to the election, you tend to have a higher voter turnout. The voter turnout in the 2020 election, the most recent as we record this, which is Biden versus Trump, was the largest in over 100 years. And I'm going to guess that the 2024 election with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump will probably beat that. But we're not done with George Bush, Jerry. In fact, what other presidential election did George W. Bush take part in?
2004.
2004 is number 6 with John Kerry. Bush won by just 35 electoral votes, which is, he won 53% of all electoral votes. But he did win the popular vote this time at just under 2.5% margin of victory. Slightly higher voter turnout here as well, with 60%. Now, foreign policy was the dominant theme throughout the election campaign, particularly Bush's handling of the war on terror and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, remember, Bush was elected in 2000. He was inaugurated 2001. 9/11 happens that September. So it's a vastly different America than when he was elected the prior time. So of course, that's a huge talking point this time. Domestic issues were debated as well. Economy, healthcare, same-sex marriage, blah, blah. Ohio was the tipping point state this time and was considered to be the state that allowed Bush to win re-election. This is the most recent presidential election in which the Republican nominee won the popular vote by a 2% margin. So every election since then, the Republican nominee has lost the popular vote, even if they won the electoral vote. I talked about his legacy before Bush, but one other thing I'll add is that at various points in his presidency, he was among both the most popular and most unpopular presidents. He received the highest recorded approval ratings in the wake of 9/11, but he also received the lowest ratings during the 2007-2008 financial crisis. So George Bush really saw it all as far as public opinion goes.
It was a wild time, and little did we know what was ahead after that.
All right, let's get out of Bushland, as much as I hate to leave Bushland. And let's go to, we are missing number 4 and 1. Is that it? We just need 4 and 1? Wow, okay.
That's
flying
it?
by, Jerry. These are both pretty early elections, so I'll give you that.
I'm pretty sure I know what number 1 is.
I want to say you just talked about it recently on your pod.
Let's go with the one that I'm pretty sure is number 1, which is 1800.
There was some contention on my research because some lists had this as number 1, which is Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. John Adams is also mixed in there. But I think because of the way the electoral system was set up at the time, it was like almost disqualified from this list. Do you get what I'm saying? Am I making sense in that?
Yeah, so basically at that point, there wasn't a differentiation between a vote that was cast for president versus one that was cast for vice president. And therein came the problem because the Democrat-Republican electors cast the same number of electoral votes for Jefferson and Burr, even though Burr was supposed to be the bottom of the ticket. And so that's why it got thrown into the House of Representatives to decide.
The Burr dilemma. I see why that you'd put this in number 1. I have it as an honorable mention because it seems like we should talk about it, but it seems too messy to fit nicely in this list. But basically, like Jerry said, it went to the House of Representatives who chose between Jefferson and Burr. Alexander Hamilton favored Jefferson over Burr, and he convinced several Federalists to switch their support to Jefferson, which gave Jefferson the victory. And this is one of only 2 presidential elections, the other being number 1 on this list, that was decided by the House.
Which that one was 1824.
1824 is number 1. This is John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, who we might talk about later today as well, and Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, I think, was a good president, but man, is he a grumpy looking motherfucker. So Adams had won 38% of the electoral vote. That's all he needed to win, but he lost the popular vote by a 10% margin, the largest negative percent margin in history for a winning president. Now, the turnout here was only 27%, but don't forget, this is 1824. People are still shitting in the streets. They don't know how to go walk over to the voting ballot box and vote. The 1824 election was the first in which the popular vote was first fully recorded and reported. John Quincy Adams' path to the White House pitted him against 4 other candidates in a race that was long, difficult, and ultimately determined by a single vote in the House of Representatives. Unlike earlier elections, those running in the 1824 race were chosen based on regional popularity rather than party affiliation. So facing John Quincy Adams were John C. Calhoun, William H. Crawford, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote. Jackson did not receive enough electoral votes to win, though, so under the 12th Amendment, it fell to the House of Representatives to determine the outcome. What followed were months of lobbying as each state decided which candidate to support. John Quincy Adams won by a single vote after Henry Clay was eliminated through renegotiation, and his supporters in the House awarded their votes to John Adams. Jackson was furious when Adams turned around and chose Clay as his Secretary of State. Jackson called Clay a Judas and accused Adams and Clay of engaging in a, quote, corrupt bargain to steal the election from Jackson. But Jackson did get the last laugh because he handily defeated Adams in a rematch in 1828.
The funny thing is that, Jackson and his supporters made such a big deal about the corrupt bargain. They actually did outreach to Clay as well. And
yeah.
It was like, okay, so you were trying to do a bargain as well, but
they just bargained better than you.
Yes.
So I'm taking it from your comments that you didn't see anything wrong necessarily with the way it played out.
It was always going to be that Clay was going to support Adams. They were more aligned politically. Andrew Jackson was, and again, you have this idea of the outsider candidate as somebody who's going to clean up the corruption in Washington. The insiders and even, former presidents, Jefferson, Madison, were concerned about Jackson becoming president. And so, of course, Clay was going to go with Adams. And the only other option was William Crawford. But at that point, he had suffered a stroke. He was not in a position where he could become president, even though people were still pushing for him to be president because they thought, we can just take care of things for him.
Is Jackson the one that was like a grumpy old man with a stick? That was
yes.
Yeah, okay.
the cane
a real
that
joy to be around.
The cane that he physically beat somebody with. Yeah.
Yes, right. While president, right?
Yes.
Yes, he was president during that. Okay.
Now, granted, the person did try to assassinate him, but still.
Yeah, not very presidential,
No.
I can't wait till, in the year 2042 when you finally get to the Jackson presidency because I think there's a lot of interesting things in there. But going back to John Quincy Adams, who won the 1824 election, historians typically rank him as an average president, as he had an ambitious agenda but could not get it passed by Congress. By contrast, historians also view Adams in a more positive light during his post-presidency because of his vehement stance against slavery, as well as his fight for the rights of women and Native Americans. And Quincy Adams, as well as his father, John Adams, who was a president before him, were the only, I think, of the first 12 presidents to not be slave owners.
Yes.
Which is pretty rare for the time for someone in their position to not be a slave owner, unfortunately. Yeah. Let's talk about his daddy, though. Jerry, who did John Adams defeat to become president?
He defeated Thomas Jefferson in 1796.
You got it. This is number 4 on the list. Incumbent Vice President John Adams of the Federalist Party defeated former Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson of the Democratic Republican Party. Adams won by literally 3 electoral votes, with 51% of electoral votes achieved and 7% margin of victory in the popular vote, but this has the lowest voter turnout in the top 10 at 20%. With incumbent President George Washington having refused a 3rd term in office, the 1790s... Oh yeah, this is the first presidency after Washington, right?
Yes.
Yeah. The 1796 election became the first presidential election in which political parties competed for the presidency. And under the electoral rules in place prior to the 12th Amendment, Jerry was talking about this earlier with the Burr-Jefferson election, but the members of the Electoral College cast 2 votes each with no distinction between votes for the president and votes for the vice president. The individual with the votes of a majority of electors became president and the runner-up became vice president. What a system that would be. Imagine if that was in place now.
Oh,
Imagine
gosh.
if Joe Biden had won in 2020 and Donald Trump was his vice president. Okay, so this is the only presidential election in which a president and vice president were elected from opposing tickets. The campaign was a bitter one, with Federalists attempting to identify the Democratic Republicans with the violence of the French Revolution, and the Democratic Republicans accusing the Federalists of favoring monarchism and
Aristocratic. So this is an interesting one, and it was one basically without George Washington on the ticket, people started freaking out. How do we actually run this election again?
Because Washington, wasn't he was kind of like just chosen as president. There was no like election process with with the citizens of America. Is that true?
Yeah, basically they went through the motions, but it was pretty much assumed that every elector was going to cast one vote for George Washington. And so it really became, well, who's going to be the vice president? But this one, you finally have, okay, no, we actually have to elect somebody else besides George Washington, even though he actually, I know he got at least one electoral vote in this election, even though he wasn't running.
People didn't want to let go.
No, they didn't want to let go.
Well, he died a few years later, so it's a good thing they moved on.
It was interesting because folks had to figure out, well, how does this system really work? And this was also one, and again, something that we are still talking about in the modern era. We had foreign powers that were attempting to influence the election. You had the French minister who was trying to write letters in support of Jefferson, opposed to Adams, but he really didn't understand how the system worked. People didn't understand how the system worked. He didn't understand how it worked. And by the time his first letter was actually published, most of the electors had been chosen. The election was already a done deal.
And you said this is similar to today with foreign powers influencing elections. You're talking about New Zealand, right? Influencing
Exactly.
the 2024 election. Yeah.
You know, you've got to look out for those shifty Kiwis.
Historians and scholars have favorably ranked his administration. And I know you've done extensive coverage of the John Adams presidency and Thomas Jefferson presidency on your podcast, Presidencies of the United States. I'm going to let you plug your podcast in more depth here in a minute. But first, let's go back through this top 10. These are the closest presidential elections in American history based on the electoral vote. Number 10 is Zachary Taylor and Lewis Cass in 1848. Number 9 is Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, and George Wallace in 1968. Number 8 is Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford in 1976. Number 7 is Grover Cleveland and James Blaine in 1884. Number 6 is George W. Bush and John Kerry in 2004. Number 5 is Woodrow Wilson and Charles Evans Hughes in 1916. Number 4 is the last one we talked about, which is John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in 1796. You have Al Gore and George W. Bush in 2000 at ranking number 3. Number 2 is Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden in 1876. And number 1 is John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson in 1824, with an honorable mention to Thomas Jefferson versus Aaron Burr in 1800, which, depending on how you rank this list, I could see that being number 1. Jerry, what do you think, man? Presidential elections, they're interesting, huh?
They are interesting, and they are also exhausting.
They're exhausting.
Especially
That's what
in the
I
modern
said.
era.
I said at the beginning, like, I'm ready for this to be over. I know who I want to win, but no matter what happens, I just want it to be over. And I know there's a lot of discussion online these days that I see of like the American presidential campaigning season is like 2 years long, I feel like, where in other countries that's just not a thing. Something's got to change, but it doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon. And I hope our listeners, if you are in America today and you're listening on Tuesday, November 5th, I please encourage you to go vote and make your voice heard. Jerry, if people enjoyed today's episode, then they absolutely have to listen to Presidencies of the United States. Can you tell them a little more about it and how to listen?
Absolutely. So the Presidencies of the United States, if this episode is any indication, I do a deep dive into presidential history because we really want to understand all of the people that you may not know about, the events that you may not know about, but that help to craft what we now know of as the office of the presidency. And so I have over 200 episodes already available. I've been hosting this podcast since 2017. And I'm still so energized and so excited about learning more and sharing more about presidential history with everybody. So if you too are interested in presidential history, if you want to learn what you didn't learn in high school and go beyond just memorizing names and dates and get to know the people behind these events, please check out Presidencies. The website is presidenciespodcast.com. I'm available on all the major podcast platforms and on pretty much all the regular social media, Facebook, Instagram, the formerly known as Twitter. You can find me at all of those and more.
And I'll put a link in the show notes to Jerry's website. And I sincerely mean this. There is no one that does presidential history coverage like Jerry Landry. It's so in-depth, so interesting. You get so much out of it. I really hope everyone will check it out. Jerry, thank you so much for being here today.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me on, Nick. It's always a pleasure. I always have a great time on the Tennis Podcast and always look forward to the next list that you're going to bring to the table.
Thank you very much. And may God have mercy on our souls after this election today. Let's hope that we can all move on as a people and get past this horrible time that we're in. It is just exhausting. So I thank everyone for listening so much. I would love to know what you thought of this episode. You can follow me on social media at 10ishpod, and you can leave me a review on your favorite podcast app. You can comment directly on this post on the Spotify app, or if you are a 10ishpod Plus member, you can let me know what you thought in our private invite-only Discord channel. And if you want access to that Discord, as well as ad-free episodes, early access to new episodes, bonus content, go to 10ishpod.com/plus and get a free 7-day trial. I'm done. He's Jerry. I'm Nick. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.